friends, it's your teen and tween librarian Rebecca, and we're back for another episode of Bedtime Stories. I'm very excited. This plot is picking up so fast. Last episode, we climbed an entire mountain, and now we are descending into the crater, and hopefully we'll be able to find the location to get us to the center of the earth. Just another reminder, if you haven't signed up for summer reading yet, now is the time. You have up until I believe like August 7th to sign up, but you'll definitely want to get going now because we have a lot of fun activities. So go ahead, you can visit this website here and sign up on Beanstack. You can also download the Beanstack Tracker app. It's for free, and you can track your summer reading there and kind of get all your activities going that way. But otherwise, let's get going into chapter 16. Enjoy. Chapter 16. Inside the Crater. Supper was rapidly devoured, and the little party settled down for the night as best they could. The bed was hard, the shelter not very substantial, and the situation rather unpleasant at 5,000 feet above sea level. Yet I slept remarkably soundly that night, one of the best I'd had for a long time. I did not even have any dreams. The next day, we awoke half frozen by the sharp air, but in bright sunshine. I got up from my granite bed and went out to enjoy the magnificent spectacle which lay before me. I was standing on the summit of one of Sneffels's peaks, the one to the south. From that point, the view extended over the greater part of the island. By an optical effect common to all great heights, the shores seemed higher than the central part. It was as if one of Helbesmer's relief maps were spread out at my feet. I could see deep valleys crisscrossing in all directions, precipices hollowed out like wells, lakes reduced to ponds, and rivers turned into streams. On my right were countless glaciers and innumerable peaks, some plumed with faint wreaths of smoke. The undulations of this infinite succession of mountains, whose patches of snow looked like foam, reminded one of the surface of a stormy sea. If I turned towards the west, there the ocean stretched out in all its magnificence, like a continuation of those foaming summits. The eye could scarcely tell where the land ended and the waves began. I lost myself in that wonderful ecstasy produced by great peaks, this time without any giddiness, for I was beginning to grow accustomed at last to this sort of sublime contemplation. My dazzled gaze bathed in the transparent rays of the sun. I forgot who I was and where I was, living the life of the elves and sylphs of Scandinavian mythology. In fact, I was intoxicated by the pleasure of altitude, oblivious of the abysses into which my fate was shortly going to plunge me. But I was brought back to an awareness of reality by the arrival of Hans and the professor, who joined me on the summit of the peak. My uncle, turning to the west, pointed out to me a light vapor, a mist, or a semblance of land which rose above the horizon of the sea. "Greenland," he said. "Greenland?" I exclaimed. "Yes, we are only about 100 miles away, and during thaws, polar bears are carried here from Greenland on ice floes. But never mind that. We are at the top of Sneffels, and here are two peaks, one to the south, the other to the north. Hans will tell us what the Icelanders call the one on which we are standing now." The question having been put, the guide replied, "Skartaris." My uncle shot a triumphant glance at me. "Now for the crater!" he cried. The crater of Sneffels was in the shape of an inverted cone with an opening about a mile across. Its depth I estimated about 2,000 feet. One may imagine the condition of a reservoir of this capacity when filled with thunder and flames. The bottom of the funnel did not measure more than 500 feet in circumference, so that the fairly gentle slope made it easy to reach its lower part. I was involuntarily reminded of a huge funnel-shaped blunderbuss, and the comparison alarmed me. To go down into a blunderbuss, I thought, when it may be loaded and may go off at the slightest touch is sheer lunacy. But there was no going back. Hans, with an air of indifference, set off in front again, and I followed him without a word. To make the descent easier, Hans wound his way down the cone in long ellipses. We had to walk among the erupted rocks, some of which, shaken out of their sockets, went bouncing down to the bottom of the abyss. Their fall awoke reverberating echoes which were strangely sonorous. In some parts of the cone there were glaciers. Here Hans advanced only with extreme caution, sounding his way with his iron stick to discover crevasses. At certain doubtful points, we had to fasten ourselves together with a long rope, so that if anyone unexpectedly lost his footing, he would be held up by his companions. This was a prudent precaution, but it did not exclude all danger. In spite, however, of all the difficulties of the descent on slopes with which the guide was unfamiliar, it was accomplished without accident, except for the loss of a coil of rope, which slipped from the hands of one of the Icelanders and took the shortest way to the bottom of the abyss. By noon we had arrived. I had raised my head and saw above me the upper aperture of the cone, framing a greatly reduced but almost perfectly circular patch of sky. At one point, only the peak of Scartaris stood out, rising into space. At the bottom of the crater, there were 3 chimneys through which, in the time of its eruption, Sniffles had expelled its lava and steam from its central furnace. Each of these furnaces was about 100 feet in diameter. They yawned open at our feet. I had not the courage to look into them, but Professor Liedenbrock had already made a rapid survey of all 3. He was panting for breath, running from one to the other, gesticulating and muttering unintelligible words. Hans and his companions, sitting on blocks of lava, watched him running about and obviously regarded him as a lunatic. Suddenly, my uncle gave a shout. I thought he had lost his footing and had fallen into one of the 3 chimneys, but no. I saw him with his arms outstretched and his legs wide apart in front of a granite rock which stood in the center of the crater like a huge pedestal placed there for a statue of Pluto. His attitude was one of amazement, but amazement soon gave way to delirious joy. "Axel! Axel!" he cried. "Come here! Come here!" I ran over to him. Neither Hans nor the Icelander stirred a muscle. "Look!" said the professor. And, sharing his amazement, if not his joy, I read on the western face of the block, in runic characters half worn away by time, this accursed name. "Anna Saknussemm!" cried my uncle. "Have you any doubts now?" I made no reply, and returned in consternation to my lava seat, overwhelmed by this piece of evidence. How long I remained plunged in thought I cannot say. All I know is that when I raised my head, I saw only my uncle and Hans at the bottom of the crater. The Icelanders had been dismissed, and they were now descending the outer slopes of Sneffels on their way back to Stapi. Hans was sleeping peacefully at the foot of a rock, in a stream of lava where he had made himself an improvised bed, while my uncle was circling round the bottom of the crater like a wild beast caught in a trapper's pit. I had neither the desire nor the strength to get up, and following the guide's example, I abandoned myself to an uneasy slumber, constantly imagining that I could hear noises or feel tremors in the sides of the mountain. This was how the first night inside the crater went by. The next day, a gray, cloudy, heavy sky settled over the summit of the cone. I noticed this not so much from the darkness inside the crater as from the anger which took hold of my uncle. I understood the reason for this, and hope dawned again in my heart. Let me explain. Of the 3 ways open to us beneath our feet, only one had been taken by Saknussemm. According to the Icelandic scholar, it can be recognized by the circumstance mentioned in the cryptogram, namely that the shadow of Scartaris touched its edge during the last days of June. That sharp peak could in fact be regarded as the gnomon of a sundial, whose shadow on a given day pointed out the way to the center of the earth. Now, if the sun failed to shine, there would be no shadow and consequently no guide. It was the 25th of June. If the sky would only remain cloudy for 6 days, the expedition would have to be postponed for another year. I will not attempt to describe Professor Liedenbrock's helpless anger. The day wore on, and no shadow appeared on the bottom of the crater. Hans did not stir from his place, even though he must have wondered what we were waiting for, if he ever wondered anything. My uncle did not speak to me once. His gaze, perpetually directed toward the sky, was lost in its gray and misty depths. On the 26th, there was still no sign. Sleet fell all day. Hans built a hut with blocks of lava. I derived a certain pleasure from studying the countless little waterfalls running down the sides of the cone, making a deafening sound which was amplified by each and every stone. My uncle could no longer contain himself. The situation was enough to irritate a more patient man than himself, for it was tantamount to sinking within sight of land. But heaven always mingles great joys with great vexations, and it held in store for Professor Liedenbrock a satisfaction to match his desperate anxiety. The next day, the sky was still overcast, but on Sunday, the 28th of June, the last day but 2 of the month, a change in the weather came with the change of the moon. The sun poured its rays into the crater. Every hillock, every rock, every stone, every roughness had its share of the torrent of light and promptly cast its shadow over the ground. Among them all, that of Scartaris stood out like a sharp edge and started turning imperceptibly with the sun. My uncle turned with it. At midday, in the shortest period of its course, it gently touched the edge of the central chimney. "It's there!" cried the professor. "It's there! Now for the center of the earth!" he added in Danish. I looked at Hans. "Forut," the guide said calmly. "Forward!" replied my uncle. It was 13 minutes past 1. And that's the end of chapter 16. Thank you for joining us for another episode of Bedtime Stories. Make sure you never miss an episode by subscribing to the library's YouTube channel. You can also find out what's happening at the library by visiting us on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram. Or you can always just go to the library's website. I hope to see you again for the next episode of Bedtime Stories, but until then, be well and sleep well.